Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our penultimate Black Country Society virtual heritage meeting before Christmas. Now, I don't know about you, but time certainly seems to be flying for me these days. We take it in turns to chair these meetings. So tonight we have Chris Baker handling the technical side. Ward Jones will be handling questions and comments after our talk. And I'm Andrew Homer, chairing for this evening. So just a couple of quick housekeeping points before we start. Please keep your microphones turned off if you would. For questions and comments, please put them in the Zoom chat. And then at the end of our talk, Ward will go through them after the presentation. The talks are recorded, and this one will appear in due course on the Black Country Society website and on YouTube. So with no further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Steve Roughton. Now, as a chartered civil and structural engineer, Steve has over 30 years experience of defying gravity, designing and investigating structures, many in the Black Country, many over old coal, limestone and ironstone workings. Steve has cultivated an interest in the forensic examination of over 50 crooked buildings in Britain, applying his technical knowledge and love of culture to investigate their history, mystery, and reason for their distortion. The Crooked House at Himley was, and despite its demise, still is #1 on Steve's compendium of crookeds. So, without any further ado, over to Steve Roughton and Crooked Britain, the Crooked House at Himley, and some crooked survivors. Over to you, Steve.
Steve, you're muted. Could you unmute yourself?
Steve, I think you're on mute. The audio button on the bottom right side.
That's fine. Yeah, you're there now, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for that introduction, and welcome everybody to my presentation, Crooked Britain, a wake to the Crooked House at Himley and a wake-up call to the crooked survivors. A call to preserve our quirky heritage, to save what we have and reflect on what we've lost. First, a warning. I may wander off piste a few times. Well, I will. Jump around a bit. So to keep up, sadly, you'll have to stay awake and be alert. Crooked Britain, a title with a double meaning. Crooked buildings and crooked deeds. Many of the crooked buildings I've researched have crooked tales to tell, mystery and myth to unravel. None more so than my all-time favourite, the Crooked House at Himley, which lived for over 250 years. Listing to one side for around 180 of them. Listing, but not listed. Not given historic England's protection. I'll come back to that later. We're all aware of the tragic events that befell the Crooked House, the tale of woe. But with the council serving an enforcement notice on the owners to rebuild within 3 years, the Crooked House that was is set to be the Crooked House that is, albeit a replica. Planning inquiry pending next spring 2025. No more of the remaining crookeds should be lost. So let's have a scan around some crooked survivors, gems set in the landscape that make up our rich cultural heritage, eccentrics that represent a sense of place and make us smile. And here's a few. Just a selection sprinkled around the country, surrounding our old lost friend in the centre. A few of the quirky vernacular oddities, as I call them, which grace our land. A unique breed. Let's call them the Crookeds, which should be recognised as such, preserved and protected. Twisted spires, leaning towers, all manner of eccentric buildings, jumbled and wonky timber frames, crooked chimneys. Some are crooked by design and others by accident, like the numerous wonky church towers and spires, including the other icon. We spotted it there in the top left-hand corner, the unmissable crooked spire of Chesterfield, which I'll speak about later. Or an unknown one here, the bottom and the middle and the bottom row there, the wonkiest church in Britain. Imagine this, the tower and the nave in line. The tower slips one way and the nave tilts the other. Crazy structure I've investigated. And the crooked chimneys on the left, the full barley twist, a rare endangered species. Or the strange bending chimneys, they were built vertical, but in a small area of South Devon, they all now mysteriously bend into the prevailing southwesterly wind. Illogical, but there's a reason. Blowing back the smoke, not much good for an open fire. And what about the crooked chimneys, the zigzags that live in the home counties? I found 10 of those surrounding London. Another mystery. All paying homage to the origin of the species. That one there. The Crooked Chimney Public House at Welling. All crooked buildings have a tale to tell. None more so than our old departed friend, the most unique eccentric of all, the crooked house at Himley, now sadly lost. Okay, let's lighten the mood. Let's indulge in some happy nostalgia, share some of the history and mystery of the crooked house. Firstly, we'll take a peep at some old photographs. You may not have seen these before. Let's have a look. Ah, the mystery table. Men marvelling at the ball rolling uphill. Familiar? Or what about the slanting bedroom, the sliding bed, propped up and tied to the wall? Beforehand, slumberers would fall asleep on one side of the room and wake up on the other. Did the earth move for them, or just the bed? And last one here of the leaning passageway, which used to run front to back of the crooked house, like a ship listing at sea. See the waiter desperately trying not to spill the drinks. Photographs taken around 1900, when the crooked house had achieved celebrity status, when postcards were printed encouraging coachloads of people to visit, all eager to sample the gravitational tricks played upon the eye. Recognise the photographs? No? If you're not familiar with these inside photographs, let's take a walk outside. Have a look at the familiar frontage. Just a minute. I can't hear you say. This isn't the crooked house at Himley. Clearly not. We're not even in the Black Country. We're in the White Country. As the crow flies, 20 miles due south of Himley, in the white lands of Droitwich Spa. And the photograph is taken of the wagon and horses, aka the Crooked House of Droitwich. See there on the flag. Similar, aren't they? Except that the Crooked House of Droitwich is not detached. It's supported by its neighbours. Still is a survivor, not a pub anymore, just a retail outlet, which sadly has lost its original inside quirky features. As well as sharing the same angular tricks and optical illusions, something else links the two crooked pubs. The man who made the town crooked. This man, John Corbett, with his wife, Anna Eliza O'Mara, a black countryman, born within a few miles of the Crooked House at Himley, in Brierley Hill, bringing his black country engineering skills to the area. John Corbett has succeeded in pumping out the salt in Droitwich, where others had failed, by lining the salt shafts with cast iron cylinders, which prevented the ingress of water, keeping the brine pure. And from this, he began his meteoric rise to power and riches, a larger-than-life character known locally as the Salt King. There he is with his wife, the Salt Queen, and the Salt King, salt royalty. And as with coal mining in the Black Country, industrial pumping of salt in the White Country during the second half of the 19th century led to severe subsidence. So severe, it reversed the curvature of Droitwich High Street from a slight hill to a serious depression. And right in the middle of that depression was the Crooked House pub, which became as distorted as its namesake in Himley. By the end of the 19th century, subsidence was so severe that townsfolk believed the earth might open up and swallow the houses. Swallow them. Visitors to the town felt decidedly seasick. Ironically, most were seeking the curative therapy of the brine baths, which, quite frankly, after experiencing all that lopsidedness, they needed. Some of Droitwich's wonky buildings remain, and here they are. It's the rear of the Crooked House, and another view towards the High Street, looking at the wonky buildings. And there in the middle that's the old domed brine pump, a relic of the past. And John Corbett, the black countryman, what of the man? Well, he was an ambivalent character, philanthropic, paternalistic, and controlling. He controlled the salt production, creating a monopoly by stifling opposition, buying up most of Droitwich to prevent the passage of salt pipes by rivals. Not content with controlling the salt, he also sought to control people's lives. He wrote a set of rules to his workers. How to be pious and hardworking, including how to choose a wife. It's a bit risky, that one. A lesson he sadly didn't take on board. I'll come back to that in a moment. The Salt King salted away all his surplus cash and built a French chateau on the outskirts of town for his wife, the Salt Queen, Anna O'Mara, a cultivated young Irishwoman who had been brought up and educated in Paris. And here it is, the Chateau Himley. Bad for a black country lad. This magnificent fairy tale palace stands as a monument to Anna's extravagant dream, paid for out of the riches of salt. If coal was the black gold of the black country, then salt was the white diamonds of the white country, for those that controlled its production. In 1875, the Corbetts were ready to move into their fairy tale chateau. They never did. A scandal befell them. Mere tittle-tattle, which I'm sure won't be of any interest to an educated audience like yourselves. You are? Okay. Promise not to tell anyone. I'll be brief. During the construction of the chateau, it was rumoured that Anna Eliza, the Salt Queen, had grown fond of the local Catholic priest, a man who lived up to his ecclesiastical title of father, when Anna unexpectedly became expectant. And she couldn't even go to confession. I mean, the priest already knew. Enraged, the Salt King John Corbett invoked his royal prerogative. He banished his wife to Tywin in North Wales, providing her with a meagre allowance, which he threatened to cut off if she misbehaved again. She never returned. Good riddance, she said. But I'm wandering off piste. I did warn you. Time to leave the White Country and return to the Salt King's homeland, back to Black, to the Glyn Arms at Himley. Let's have a look at some old photographs. You've all seen this one, or some of you have. I'm not tricking you this time. This is the crooked house, and by the look of it, it's a crooked tree, which is bending and in sympathy, taken around the turn of the century. A more recent view you'll all be familiar with, sadly gone. And an old view showing the magic table and the bottle rolling uphill with my arrow and the sloping passageway and door. These photographs, these inside photographs, are interchangeable with the crooked house at Droitwich. An iconic building loved by all, where if you tried to lean against the wall, it pushed you away. A building which defied the laws of gravity, where balls and bottles rolled uphill, where angles played tricks upon the eye. To solve the optical illusion of the crooked house, let's have a look at the overall picture. Here we are, the mystery solved. Inside, with the crooked angles, the eye is deceived. The horizontal and vertical are distorted. See the ball roll uphill from the perceived horizontal. Outside, gravity is restored. The ball isn't fooled by this trickery. It always rolls down the hill. The crooked house wasn't always so. It wasn't built crooked. The uncrooked house was reportedly built in 1765 as a farmhouse watermill to be called Coppice Mill. Maybe it looked a little like this. Coppice Mill reimagined. The uncrooked house, handsome and well proportioned, I'd say. Estate records show the mill ground bran used in bread making. By one grinding of the grain, a dark brown flour was produced, unrefined for the working class. Wholesome wholemeal. Grinding the flour several times removed the dark husk, producing a whiter flour, a more refined flour for the more refined classes. White bread for the upper crust. Ironically, this snowy white flour, eaten and favoured by the fashionable upper classes, was much less nutritious. If only the local gentry, the Earls of Dudley, knew what we know now. And the mill also ground split peas, made into peas pudding or pea soup, simple food for the poor, full of nutrients and vitamins. The first mushy pea or pay. The mill farmhouse was part of the Oak Farm estate, owned by 3 generations of the Glyn family, and the estate finally passed to Sir Stephen Glyn the 9th Baronet, the man who in the mid-19th century gave his name to the iconic pub to be, the Glyn Arms, later to be known by its universal moniker, the Crooked House. And what of the man, the owner of the icon to be? Well, the omens weren't good. Father and grandfather, confusingly both named Sir Stephen, died early. In 1780, the Reverend Stephen Glyn, the 7th Baronet, died while out hunting, suffering a ruptured blood vessel. Oh, the irony of it. Engaged in a blood sport, the hunter became the victim, outfoxed by the fox. That was the end of Grandad. And in 1815, Sir Stephen's father, Sir Stephen Glyn, the 8th Baronet, died of tuberculosis in France, aged just 35, which left, at the tender age of 8, young Sir Stephen Glyn, number 9, here he is, the 9th and final Baronet, who inherited the Coppice Mill, the uncrooked house, as part of the Oak Farm estate, a relatively small landowning of just around 94 acres. Was Sir Stephen Glyn, the 9th, predestined, fated as his paternal ancestors, to die young? No. He lived rather, to a reasonable age, as then, of 66. His life, however, was troubled. No, it wasn't. Look at him. Does he look troubled? I mean, Mr. Calm, come on. What I meant to say was, the life which surrounded him was troubled. Sir Stephen Glyn, number 9, I mean, he chose not to be troubled by life's inconveniences. If only. He offloaded his estate responsibilities and engaged on his obsession of visiting and describing churches. He was a church spotter, a steeplechaser, an architectural historian, permanently engaged in a grand tour at home and abroad. And with a substantial income from Oak Farm and his large family estate in Hawarden in North Wales, he had no need to toil. So he didn't. Stephen's primary education began in West Bromwich. From there, he was transported by his mother to Eton, West Brom to Eton. Not a common lineage nowadays. And from Eton, he went to Oxford University, Christchurch, where he befriended his brother-in-law to be, the future 4 times Prime Minister, W.E. Gladstone, the man who would save Oak Farm estate, including the Crooked House, from bankruptcy. Coppice Mill was sited on the northern part of the Oak Farm estate, surrounded by land owned by the Earl of Dudley, a man who seemed to own the rest of the Black Country, including his home, this Himley Hall, which lay just over the road from the Crooked House to be. Rebuilt from a medieval pile in 1764 into a grand Palladian house, handily situated just far enough away from the Dudleys' mines and industry. And in 1830, the lush green Himley Hall and the still green, only just, Oak Farm estate over the road contrasted with the industrial landscape that lay around them in neighbouring Dudley. How do we know? Too early for photographs. Well, we have arguably the greatest painter to show us, J.M.W. Turner, no less. The man who was called modern art. Throughout the 1820s, Turner painted seascapes and bucolic landscapes. In 1832, compiling his Picturesque Views of England and Wales series. Turner must have taken a wrong turn and arrived in Dudley. And that was before sat-nav sent us the wrong way. And here he created one of his watercolour masterpieces, Dudley, Worcestershire. What a magnificent painting. Not a picturesque view, but an evocative view, an image of Dudley as then in all its smoke-blackened red furnace glory. One which captures the atmospheric, gloomy scene of a scarred, blackened industrial landscape, set against the backdrop of Dudley Castle, the original home of the Earls of Dudley, there on the hill. And from the castle, what a view! More like, phew, what a smell. No wonder they moved. So they say every picture tells a story, and art historians, always on the lookout for a hidden message, suggest that Turner is directing the viewer's eye to a symbolic twist of smoke. Do you see that there? Swirling in front of the lighter church steeple beyond there. Is this a metaphor, they say? The twisting black coil, a malevolent wraith depicting the darkness of industry, masking the purity, the uprightness of the ecclesiastical backdrop. Maybe. Too pretentious. Just a minute. Why don't we make up our own story? I mean, didn't Sir Stephen Glynn seek out the virtual church aesthetic to escape the grotesque face of his industry, the swirling black smoke, escaping the uncomfortable reality, the black country reality of the 19th century, where houses were interspersed with blazing furnaces, heaps of burning coal, slag, piles of ironstone, forges, pit banks, engine chimneys, and crossing canals, where smoke from the furnaces, coke hearths, and mineral heaps drifted overhead, so excluding all of those who were, except those who worked there, just like this. And that was a lot of words. So I'll have a drink. Engravings were made from Turner's work, produced within the artist's lifetime. And here's the one of Dudley. Same picture in black and white, a haunting monochrome reproduction on paper. Common practice at the time, like the prints of today, affordable for the less wealthy, the democratization of art, a black and white reproduction, which in this case evokes the dark black country it depicts. Let's compare the two. I'll go back. So, which do you prefer? So there's the original. Not neither. I like them. There's the original, and there's the engraving, the reproduction. I mean, I actually like this one. There's more definition in this, more gloom. The scene contrasts with Turner's many classical beauty paintings of the 16th century Venice. Venice and Dudley, what's the link? It's staring us in the face. Canals. Turner must have been attracted to canals, gondolas and coal barges. That was his genius. Embracing the modern, having the foresight to move on from the old masters and incorporate the emerging culture of industrialization. He saw the beauty in the beast of the Industrial Revolution. And in 1835, rural Oak Farm had morphed into the Oak Farm Mining and Manufacturing Estate, established as a combined mining and iron works, joining its neighbours, well, apart from Himley all over the road, The land turned from green to black. Oak Farm followed the industry of the Earl of Dudley, who was already exploiting the rich 30-yard thick coal seam that lay below, the underlying coal seam that gave rise and name to the Black Country. And in these black lands, it was a matter of everyday occurrence for houses to fall, for buildings to tilt over, a sink into the ground in old shallow mine workings. Acquiring a site for a building was a serious problem. In the mid-19th century, the vicar of Wednesbury, speaking of a church, a new church for the parish, remarked in a made-up voice, "The church is proposed to be built in Wednesbury. We should have been building it by now had it not been for the hollow nature of the land and the difficulty in finding a solid site. 20 or 30 houses in the centre of town were thrown down by the mining under them the other day." That sets the scene. And the vicar of Dudley agreed in another voice. "There is a great want of a church at Holly Hall, but you cannot get a site which is not liable to be shaken by the workings of the mines beneath." Mr. Best, the manager of the British Iron Company, chirped in a final voice, "By the progress of the ironstone workings, houses are thrown down and the land ruined." Shakespearean, it's getting worse. Which begs the question, with everything falling down, how come the crooked house tilted so much and survived? Way back when, practicing as a structural engineer, these questions always fascinated me. I decided to have a go at solving the mystery. Anecdotally, all reports I'd read pointed to the obvious cause of the extreme tilt as coal mining. Was this the only cause? Did it happen like this? Makes sense, doesn't it? A building falling into a shallow mine working, distressed. But after studying the estate records, the geological sections and mining maps, came to believe there was a more nuanced reason for the excessive lean. Firstly, it is important to appreciate the true scale of the significant coal seam, the 30-yard thick coal seam. It wasn't shallow like the cartoon. Let's have a look. As you can see, it's located at over 100 meters below the surface. Extraction at that depth is unlikely to have caused the severe lean in such a short distance experienced by the crooked house. So, have other forces come into play to exaggerate the lean? Well, here I put forward a hypothesis. At the commencement of the thick coal mining operations, the 1840 estate map, which I got hold of, shows the stream, the mill stream, there it is, flowing to the southern end of the mill, the sinking end. Over the next decades, with continuing severe subsidence, the flooding on the streams moved around a bit. If you want to see how much, take a look at Chris Baker's Society posting, which charts the changes over the next 20 years or so. But one thing's clear. From the sequence of maps and later accounts, the crooked house was always surrounded by and inundated with water. The ground and the mill started to subside during the extraction of the thick coal in the 1840s. And from the estate records, the mill was still operating in 1851. So presumably it was still upright. The first reference to the Glyn Arms public house was noted a few years later. Subsidence would have stopped the mill wheel turning, which is likely to be the reason for the change of use from a mill to a pub, giving rise to the birth of the Glyn Arms and the birth of the crooked house. And when the ground subsided, yeah, there would have been some tilt, yeah. But the structure was predisposed to lean over to the south, exacerbated by the water, the mill wheel weight, and the vibration, a combination of milling and mining. How did the building stay intact? After all, the rest of the country, black country, as we've just heard there, was falling down. Well, to understand, let's have a look at the foundations. Oh, there we go. In the Crooked House, the whole of the basement, I had a little look down there, acts as a stiff, raft-like structure with stiff arches and cross walls, which can tilt as an entity, supporting the structure over, rather like a ship listing at sea. This inherent lower story rigidity was responsible for saving the building. Additional support there is by some steel ties, and on the gable end, 3 big buttresses give it lateral stability. And the sinking of the Glyn Arms became a metaphor, another one, for the Oak Farm estate, which was also sinking at the time, just this time, sinking into financial ruin. A few years before the crash, Sir Stephen Glyn had a stroke of good fortune, not a stroke. While he was to remain a bachelor, both his sisters, Mary and Catherine, and his brother Henley married. Much interest and speculation surrounded the courtship of his sisters, who were known as the beautiful Glyns. And here they are, Sir Stephen and the beautiful Glyns. On July the 25th, 1839, the speculation ended when Catherine Glyn, there at the bottom, married William Ewart Gladstone, the future Prime Minister. And Mary Glyn, the top, married George, Lord Littleton of Hagley Hall, in a double ceremony at Hawarden, up in North Wales, where they got an estate. On this double marriage, Sir Stephen Glyn gave his 2 brother-in-laws 1/10 shares in the Oak Farm mining estate. Considering later events, this benevolent gesture turned out to be the shrewdest decision of Glyn's non-business career. An act of benevolence that saved him from ruin. 2 years later, 1841, the business was in serious financial trouble. Sir Stephen, the major shareholder, offloaded his directorship responsibilities to Gladstone to pursue his hobby of visiting and recording church architecture. And the day-to-day running of Oak Farm was bestowed to an agent, James Boydell, the mad inventor. That's another story. Who in turn passed the baton to chartmasters, known as locally as butties, men who exploited and controlled the miners. The colliers hated this iniquitous butty system where they were paid in food and reckoning drink at the pub or truck shop, as it was known. And later, the Glyn Arms, the Crooked House, was used as a truck shop. Crooked in another way. In 1842, with a plummeting market, the partners of Oak Farm signed a document which proposed to reduce production by 50% and halve the miners' wages. And here is that edict, formulated by Gladstone and signed by him there at the bottom. Above him there, it's James Boydell, signature, Sir Stephen Glyn, and at the top, Lord Littleton, all embroiled in the debt. What about the poor old miners? Through need and loss of earnings, the miners went on strike. They worked the harvest, they pawned the clothes, they begged to subsist, and they were forced to steal potatoes and turnips from the fields. Market forces were against them, as usual. Inevitably, the men lost their battle. They were starved back to work and returned in just 6 weeks. And while the miners toiled, Sir Stephen Glynn toured. So where was the great Houdini, the great escapee? Well, I can tell you where he was on April the 22nd, 1841. He was visiting yet another church. Ironically, this one, the Crooked Spire of Chesterfield. That's where he was. And the man who was to become the owner of the other iconic crooked structure was not convinced the spire was crooked, as he explains in his notes. The spire appears to be twisted, which arises from a special way of putting on the lead. This is an unfortunate drawback in its appearance, which otherwise, from its height and elegant proportions, would be fine. Appears to be twisted. Call yourself an architectural historian. What? Tosh. But this was a theory. The theory of the lead appearing to twist the spire convinced others at the time. An illusion, it was said, brought about by the pattern of fixing the lead in a herringbone fashion. Another theory was that it was built crooked. Well, as we know, the spire is indeed crooked and not built so. Right. If I put on my technical hat, technically, like the crooked house, the spire is a structural failure. I'll take my hat off. Aesthetically, culturally, like the crooked house, the spire is a structure that never failed to please. In December 1817, after much public disquiet, 2 independent reports concluded the spire to be unsafe and they recommended demolition. But a group of townspeople wouldn't accept the verdicts. They'd grown fond of the crooked old lady in their midst. An action group formed. Ring a bell? Save the crooked spire. Save the crooked house. They recommended a further survey be carried out, this time by James Ward of Sheffield. And he told them what they wanted to hear. On the January the 24th, 1818, he reported the spire could be made to stand for a century or more with little repair. Early conservation in action. A crooked saved. The spire was repaired, maintained, and protected, not only for the town, but for the nation. The crooked spire and the crooked house that was represented the twin icons of British vernacular oddity, if you like, unintentional eccentrics. They were unrivaled in the world. Can't find them anywhere else. Both representing the essence of place, a sense of place. From loathing to loving, the Chesterfield townsfolk stood up for the curio in their midst, as have the Save the Crooked House supporters who have never given up. The beautiful beast matters to the residents, and it matters to us all. Visiting churches was Sir Stephen Glynn's vocation, his obsession. During his life, he inspected and made notes on over 5,000 churches in England, Wales, and Ireland. No wonder he was never in Dudley. As owner of the Crooked House, he unwittingly visited many more crooked structures, many more crooked churches. And from his notes, he was oblivious or seemingly not interested in their quirkiness, more interested in their fine ecclesiastical features. And here's some more crooked churches Sir Stephen visited. In 1846, he was in Shropshire, the twisted spire of St. Mary's at Clearbury Mortimer, with its associations with Isabella, the manipulative she-wolf of France. I feel another metaphor coming on, but let's not go there. In 1850, he was in Cornwall, looking at the crooked spire of St. Enodoc, the burial place of the poet laureate Sir John Betjeman, a church which in the 18th century was fossilized. Difficult to believe now, but just the steeple, the crooked steeple was sticking out. It was covered with drifting sand. Another crooked saved. In 1852, he was to be found at the tilting tower of St. Margaret of Antioch, Marton, in North Nottinghamshire, sited close to the River Trent. See the anchor? Well, that prevents the church from lurching further into the marsh, or so they say. In 1860, he was in Lincolnshire visiting the Leaning Tower of St. James's at Drydoddington. You can see there the tower is playing a tug of war with the nave. Don't let go. Here we have some mysterious encrypted stones on the tower, yet to be deciphered. Just some of the crooked family visited by Sir Stephen. And before we go, just 13 miles west of the crooked house, you may have seen this, we find the most leaning tower in the country. There it is. Athelfleda's Tower in Bridgenorth, 21 metres high, leaning at 17 degrees, 4.5 times that of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, a casualty of the Civil War. And Athelfleda, well, she was the daughter of Alfred the Great, who fought off the Vikings. And she did as well. So many tales to tell, but with so little time left, it's time I return to Oak Farm to finish off the tale of woe. I think I've jumped off piste again. Where were we? Oh, yes. Right. I'll recap. The crooked house was sinking in sympathy with the sinking finances of the estate. Gladstone sorted out the mess. He wrote hundreds of letters during the bankruptcy hearings. The affair affected his early political career. Between 1847 and 1852, he wrote, he was barely, or scarcely, a member of Parliament. Quote, my time and mind being principally occupied in bearing the sole responsibility and chief labour of this complicated business. And in 1848, the year of the bankruptcy hearing, the debts had written alarmingly to 250,000 roundabout. That's over £30 million today. To pay off the debts, Sir Stephen's brothers-in-law, Lord Littleton and Gladstone, suffered heavy financial loss, and extensive lands from the Howden estate up in North Wales had to be sold. Bankruptcy was only averted by Gladstone's astute management. All this from accepting a gift of 1/10 share from Sir Stephen, a costly wedding present. The business limped on until 1864, when the final machinery was sold off. And here's the sale of goods poster with all the bits and pieces. I often think that the Glyn Arms should have been renamed the Gladstone Arms in recognition of his sacrifice. On June the 17th, 1874, characteristically returning from a foray in Essex, a church, Sir Stephen Glyn collapsed and died, a bachelor with no heirs. The estate was bequeathed to Gladstone, who made the funeral arrangements and wrote at the time, my brother-in-law was a man of singular refinement and of remarkable modesty. His memory was, on the whole, decidedly the most remarkable known to me of the generation and country. His life, however, was retired and unobtrusive. Very diplomatic. Considering the aggravation, the heartache, and the heavy financial personal cost caused by the Oak Farm inheritance, Gladstone's tribute to Sir Stephen Glynn is touching and humbling, whilst others criticised him for his effeteness and weakness. Gladstone saw the refined and the erudite. He wouldn't speak ill of the dead. Queen Victoria wrote a letter of condolence to the family and me. Having read the personal tributes to the great escapee, you know what? Maybe I've been a bit harsh. I mean, after all, he was born into aristocracy. It wasn't his choice. Okay, if he'd have stayed in West Brom, he would have been more grounded. But his mother sent him to Eton. Onwards he went to Christchurch, Oxford, to study classics. Not exactly ideal vocational training to manage a coal mining and iron manufacturing business. And what was to become of the Crooked House? The estate in 1875 was conveyed to Gladstone's son, William, who in 1876 sold it to John Walker. And from 1880 onwards, it was transformed into a tourist attraction. Here's a postcard, then known as the Sidon House, local dialect for sloping or tilting. A similar one was produced for the Crooked House at Himley. Right, time's marching on, so I'll skip through the 20th century when ownership of the Crooked House changed a few times in private hands until the breweries took over. In 1940, Johnson and Phipps, the Wolverhampton brewers, purchased it, succeeded by Wolverhampton and Dudley breweries and then Marston's, until the final fateful sale to AT Farms in July 2023. Just a few dates to note in the 20th century. November 1954, the building started to move. And that was when the third brick, the triangular brick buttress, was added to the middle of the south sinking wall. And in 1956, more strengthening was needed. A steel frame was constructed within, and the roof tiles were replaced with lightweight shingle. And in 1986, following an accidental fire, which destroyed half the roof and damaged the public bar, the Crooked House undertook a facelift, including a rear extension, restaurant extension. Now, this remarkable building stood for over 250 years, tilted for over 180 of them, withstanding severe subsidence, fire and flood, until a suspected arsonist struck, until it was illegally demolished. Could it have been prevented? Who knows? More safeguards could have been put in place beforehand. I mean, the Crooked House was registered by the council as a non-designated heritage asset. I'll repeat that. It was a non-designated heritage asset. What on earth does that mean? Seems like it was a building of special interest, but not sufficient interest to ensure survival. In July 2023, after the Marston sale, was an opportunity missed. If buildings are under threat, planners have the power under the Building Preservation Notice to allocate a temporary listing by serving a Section 3 notice. After the sale, one such notice would have taken immediate effect, giving 6 months equivalent listing protection. Before the fire, the council did apply to have the Crooked House formally listed. Historic England received the application from the council for full listing at the end of July, just prior to the fire. And reportedly, they were in the process, quote, of carefully considering it. Too late. The system failed. Are there other crooked structures to save? Yep. Over the years, I've studied over 50 of them. The vernacular oddities, many are officially recognised or protected, not all. The crooked house at Himley was always #1 on my compendium of crookeds. How ironic. Just 5 miles from Himley, the Tilted Barrel pub, a descendant of the crooked house with similar gravity-defying features, was protected by Grade 2 listing in 1987. The Tilted Barrel takes over the mantle of the most crooked inn in the land, mimicking its illustrious, even departed mentor. And the legacy of coal mining in the Black Country lives on with another building. Let's have a look, this one. Yes, the Jerusha, if I pronounced that right, Tilted Cottage, reconstructed crooked at the wonderful Black Country Museum in, again, 1987. An endangered species now kept in a building museum. Some of you might remember in 1970, Jody Mitchell wrote a prophetic song called Big Yellow Taxi, which includes the lines, and I'm not going to sing them. Feel free, I can't hear you. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And they took all the trees and they put them in a tree museum and charged the public $1.50 just to see them. Words that could have been written to reflect the passing of the sycamore gap tree in Northumberland. But words which lament a universal loss of culture. There are many more eccentric buildings to cherish throughout the land, all part of our rich, quirky heritage. All have tales to tell, and all deserve to be recognised. The crookeds, preserved and protected. Let no more disappear, and let the crooked house that was be a catalyst for recognising and protecting all the quirky vernaculars within our midst that represent our priceless cultural landscape, giving us a sense of place, an essence of place. And the rebuilding. Planning inquiry is scheduled for next spring 2025. The crooked house that was is set to become the crooked house that is, which I've reimagined here. Sorry about that. It's the best I could do. It's an image to talk about. Let's hope